morning, everybody. So today we have, as I just joked about that, we have the simplest book in the Bible. That's the book of Job. So, a few things before we'll go into the whole story. The name of Job, actually, depending how you treat it, okay? And people debating that, but there is a possibility that comes from the verb to persecute, but it's kind of like a form. So he is the persecuted one, which makes perfect sense. That's thing number one. Thing number two is, unlike with many other books that are not perfectly, I would say, labeled, we have a challenge to understand who wrote the book and when it was written. Because on one hand, we have resemblances to what is called patriarchal society. We have one guy who is in charge, and he is the one who is a civil leader. On the other hand, he is the one who does the sacrifices. So therefore, we do not have a separation of the kind of like a kingly authority and the priestly authority. He is same type of guy as probably Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob would be. So therefore, it kind of, some of the scholars prefer to put it back then. So it happened in the days of the patriarchs. But when we consider the territory where it happened, and we need to understand that in the first few chapters we have some kind of clues for that, okay? So all of you know how to draw a holy land within 3 moves, right?
Was there what?
How to draw a holy land, okay? Israel. So you have Mediterranean Sea, you have Galilean Lake, and you have Jordan and the Dead Sea, okay? That's what it is. So the thing is, in chapter 1 and 2, we have 2 other geographical, let's say, pointers, 2 geographical locations. One of them is Sabaeans come and attacked us. Okay, so who are Sabaeans? Sabaeans, or Shebeans, whatever, it's like down there below, lower than Ethiopia. So those guys come from, really far on the south. And then we also have Chaldeans. Okay, who Chaldeans are. The Chaldeans are, it's a territory of Babylon and then Persia. So that's your Chaldeans. So where would they meet? They probably would meet somewhere in between, and so most likely the land of Uz is somewhere in Edom. And there are passages in the Bible that refer to Edom as part of the Edom is Uz. I once heard a very interesting story or idea that Uz is a shorter for Uzbekistan. So all of that happens like way over there. Okay, cool theory. For me as a person from the former Soviet Union, it's even rather funny theory than anything else. I would not take it seriously, very seriously. One simple reason is we do not really know of any connections of the biblical people with that territory. And the reason that why we need to have a somewhat stronger connection is the very simple fact. Because Job confesses the covenant name of God. He doesn't simply say God. He says Yahweh from time to time. That's the one in our, what is that? Not particularly in the memory verse, but in the same chapter 19, that's the one, for I know that my Redeemer lives. Okay? And that's the one. So there is a usage of the word Yahweh who comes to him. So probably not. Though theoretically it's possible, because we know that Solomon had connections from Israel up to India. Okay, so theoretically all of this land was under somewhat influence of the biblical worship. Now, with kind of semi-solving the problem of time and the date of narrative, we need to think about the themes. So if you go into the block of themes, what I wrote is, as usual, so first of all, when we think about book of Job, and when people think about the book of Job, what does it talk about? What's the main theme usually pops up?
His family.
Okay, it's a personal struggle. Okay, guy goes through a serious crisis in his life.
Yeah.
And not like middle-age crisis, you know, when you're about 40 years old and you don't know, should you pursue this career, or maybe you can turn one of your hobbies into career. No, I mean, this is serious. I mean, if we read Bible carefully, we understand that the guy goes through such a struggle that, I mean, I hope I will be able to overcome with the Lord's help, but I would definitely not volunteer, not ever try to step up for this kind of stuff. And this is true. This is a personal struggle. He goes basically through almost death and resurrection. He has a lot. Now everything is gone. His kids, whatever he owned, his wife, depending how you read chapter 3, kind of at least steps out of the active participation in his life. Let's put it this way. Usually her words are translated as, just curse God and die. Okay, technically, I know it's a tricky thing. The verb that she uses is actually bless. It's the same word that we use for may the Lord bless you and keep you, so on and so forth. So it's hard to exactly translate what she says, but in any case, there is no involvement of wife after that phrase in his life, or within the narrative. Okay? 3 of his friends who appear are kind of very interesting guys. I mean, they are really good friends, up to the point they open their mouth. It's very good to have friends who come and just sit with you and kind of support you with their presence. And that's great. They did job awesome. For about a week they were sitting together, saying nothing. Then they decided that they have something to say. And that's basically, we have the whole book about that. So everything is uncreated. Okay? So that's why if you look at the structure, point A, Job is uncreated. He goes into formlessness. His life goes into formlessness, emptiness, because the structures around him that he used to have, they fall apart. What was filled in his life, now it's empty. As I said, kids gone. What he owned gone, and it's really dark. It comes in. He comes to a very dark moment in his life. But the thing is, again, if we read Bible very carefully, we need to understand 2 important things about Job. Thing number 1 is within whole narrative, it's 42 chapters. By the way, if you would ever, especially if you go through trouble, do not read Job, please.
Bad stuff.
Don't do that. Unless, now I can show you a trick. When you kind of get some experience, you get tricks of the trade in any trade. So in the biblical reading and in the personal devotions, I did it once, but I was smart enough, already kind of semi-skilled enough. I read chapter 42, so I've read 1, 2, then 42, just to remind myself how it ends. And then I read all the rest, keeping in mind what's going to happen in 42. Making sure that all of those troubles are directing my attention of my prayers to the point where God will say and vindicate Job and said, actually, compared to you 3 guys, he said much smarter thing, therefore let him pray for you. And maybe I will pay attention to that. and then he is restored, and so on and so forth. So, there are two things that we need to understand. Thing number one is within this narrative, from the beginning of the struggle to the very end of the restoration of Job, even at the very, very end, Job has no clue of what happened at the heavenly council. God never, ever revealed him of this wonderful dialogue that he had with Satan. Okay? So whatever befalls Job, he knows some of the information. He knows some, what's around him, what's happening. He knows of his previous relationship with God. He knows the sacrifices he made and that he was a just person. And it's very interesting. It is biblical author who called him righteous, and then God is the one who calls him righteous. Once I read a book that the whole problem of Job is because he was a self-righteous guy. He presented himself as a self-righteous guy, and that's why God tested him to make sure that he will understand that nobody is perfect, everybody has a problem, and everybody should rely on God. I don't think that's the theme for the book of Job. I really don't think so. Again, it is the author of the book who calls him just or righteous, same word in Hebrew, tzedek. Okay? And then God twice in his dialogue with Satan says, have you ever seen this, my righteous friend Job? So that's either God is a tricky God, I don't want to believe that, or he is a really righteous guy within the realm of humanity. We understand that he is not the Messiah. He is not the perfect sacrifice that could atone for the sins of the world. But as a human being, God considers him being righteous. Okay? But the thing is, so he doesn't know about that dialogue with Satan. He doesn't know this, I know it will sound relatively crude, that bet that God has with Satan in the life of Job. There is another thing that we need to always keep in mind, and is the second kind of part with the main themes, are challenges of leadership. Job is not simply a clan, the head of the big household. Okay, he is not simply the leader of a clan. He is not simply like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has few kids, lots of sheep, lots of goats, and all of this and all of that. He's more than that. Again, if he is attacked by two nations, one on the south and one on the north, and the people who survived those attacks had to run for a few days to deliver the news, that means that the territory that he controls is somewhat spread, it's somewhat distant. So what we should always remember, that he is a sheikh, if we will use the modern word, or in the biblical terms, he is a king. Okay? He has territories that he controls. He has a bigger territory than a simple family settlement. Okay? Therefore, when enemies attack the border and people are dead, okay, mostly men, what he ends up on his hands, lots of widows and lots of orphans that he has to provide. And he testifies in one of his speeches, my hand was generous, but now his heart is still generous, but he has nowhere to provide from. Okay? So it is not simply a personal struggle, it's a struggle of the shifting or challenge of the leadership. Then three friends come. Okay? If he is the king, who are the friends of a king? It's not the bodies that he went every Friday to an Irish pub to enjoy, Guinness, because Guinness is good for you. Everybody knows about that. Okay? It's not that. He is probably, I don't know, but most likely like his vizier, his prime minister, maybe minister of defense, maybe minister of the internal affairs. That's the guys who not simply challenge his personal walk before God, but that's the guys who challenge his status within the kingdom. You messed up. Therefore, you have to step down, and one of us, whoever will pursue you, whoever will be able to create a better case for the reasoning, what's behind our words, will take your place. So all of that is at play here. So again, he is not simply a guy who goes through a personal set of trouble. It is personal. It is very personal. It is his kids, not somebody else's kids who die. But it also should be seen in the very much broader social context. And that leads us to a very important thing that we find in the Bible. Is a scapegoat, theology and sociology. Scapegoat, yes. Yep. What is that? If you study anthropology, if you study different cultures, there is always somebody who is blamed for the problems of the society. Then one way or another, you deal with that person, you get rid of the person, and everybody is relieved. Okay? So the very first scapegoat that we find in the Bible is, apart from dialogue between Adam and Eve and God, okay? But the very first scapegoat technique is presented to us in Genesis chapter 4. Cain has a personal problem and semi-personal. It's also social, because by that time we know that most likely he's married, and we see mom and dad who worship, and then we have two sons who are somewhat adults, they worship. And his failure to worship properly is not only a personal matter, it's also a matter of his status within the community. But instead of dealing with his own problem, Cain does what? He finds somebody else, blames it on him, kills the guy, and he's relieved. What happens with Cain right after he murders Abel? He goes faraway land and does what? And builds the whole city. That's how it's done. Soviet Union, 1930s. It's much easier, instead of taking your own sins and work with them, confessing them, and trying to find other patterns of behavior, you can find other people who are responsible for your faults. You call them enemies of the state. You kill 2 million of them. You send another 15 or 20 millions to the prison camps where they work for free. And that's how, within about 10 years, there is a whole industrial revolution. Out of scratch, out of nothing, because the country was devastated by the Civil War. Now we have one of the most powerful countries that was prepared for the Second World War. That's how you do it. You take somebody and you deal with that person, blame it on him. And this is not the modern technique. I mean, this is modern scholars who kind of found it, but this is very old. Okay? For example, we have in our Bible, the term scapegoat comes from the Bible. Okay? You have it in Leviticus 16. Okay? In the Day of Atonement, you have two parts. One is you sacrifice a bull, or you sacrifice for the priests, and then you sacrifice a goat for the people, but you also have another goat that is taken into the wilderness and is brought far, far away, okay, to remove the sins of the people. Now, okay, we have a goat in the Bible. In the ancient cultures, in the Greek cultures, in the city-states of the Greeks, they had a similar ritual. The only difference is it was not a goat. Every year, they would gather together at the, it's called agora, kind of like a marketplace, but it's marketplace for those who can vote. So you have to be a citizen of the city-state. They would gather together and find somebody who has done most wrongful things. They will find a person who is a scapegoat in the society. And what they're going to do with the guy? What they're going to do is they will pick up stones and they will begin to throw at the person. The thing is, by no means you have to throw so hard to kill the guy in the city. Why? Because if you kill a guy in the city, what will happen? All the problems will stay in the city. So you need to drive him away of the city, throwing stones at him, and then when he leaves the boundaries, he is on his own. He's not going to go to another city. Why? Because he speaks with an accent, and therefore he's a stranger, and therefore he's most likely an enemy because he used to worship other gods. You know, the ancient cultures are somewhat cruel. And what these three friends are trying to do is to make sure that Job willingly, voluntarily acknowledges himself as this kind of scapegoat. They want to remove him, and then somebody else will be on his place. He doesn't want to do that. And so there is this dialogue between him and friends and so on and so forth. And one friend usually brings up some kind of rational arguments. Another guy brings up somewhat traditional arguments. And the third guy brings up somewhat mysterious, arguments. He says, God is such a powerful God. He even sees the faults in his angels. Okay, we don't know about faults in angels because they are not, moral, yes, good, or they don't make moral choices. They are either good or bad, period. Okay, very simple. So those kind of arguments float around and he combats them. But then, in the middle of the book, we see this wisdom that comes from above. And it's very interesting. So if you'll go into chapters 27 and to 31, and most importantly, we need to pay attention to chapter 28.
27?
28. So the block is from 27 to 31, but in 28 we have this wonderful poem basically. Where we talk about the wisdom and where it can be found. Let's say verses 12 to 18. So where shall wisdom be found, and where the place of understanding? Man does not know its worth, and it is not found in the land of the living. Okay? The deep says, it is not mine, and the sea says, it is not with me. It cannot be bought for gold, the silver cannot be weighted as its price, and so on and so forth. So we have this theme of wisdom that goes over and over again. But we know, what is the beginning of wisdom?
Knowledge.
Fear of the Lord.
Fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So when you have fear of the one who is on one hand the creator, but on the other hand is the one who provides for all the life. He is simultaneously on one hand transcendent because he is not part of this created world. He is the one who created it. He is above it. But he is not so far away as ancient gods. He is very involved with his world. As, we've talked at the worship service about that. As Luther says in his explanation to the first article of faith in the Creed. When I believe in God the Father, maker of heaven and earth. He created all creatures, but he also created me. My body, my soul. He provides for me daily. He is the one who gave me clothing and shoes and food and drinks and so on and so forth. He is the one. So an understanding of this God who is simultaneously immanent, which means close, Okay? And transcendent is the fear of this God, this fearful relationship is the beginning of wisdom. And then after this speech, after this search for the wisdom, because it is only the wisdom can help you to go through this kind of troublesome times. Faith based on that. Or faith or wisdom is based on faith. When you go through this dark tunnel of life, the only thing you have is faith, because you do not see, you do not walk by sight, you walk by faith. So when you go through that, when you have this search for the deeper wisdom, this wisdom that comes from tough experience, then we come to the other end. And in the other end, unlike three friends, we suddenly meet one guy whose name is Elihu.
Who?
Elihu. Who? Elihu. So he is my God.
Oh.
Okay? And then, unlike friends who try to remove Job from his position, he kind of says that you need to be very careful with what you say, Job. Because sometimes you can cross, you can go overboard. You can cross the line of good and faithful piety. But in reality, instead of scolding him, he kind of directs him to God. He is a prelude for God's intervention. And then, from chapters 38 to beginning of 42, we have God who speaks. And this is very interesting. Let's go to 38. If you follow the structure that I gave you, so it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 block in the book. When God speaks to man, when God breathes toward man, and that's what recreates Job, actually. The dialogue between God and man brings back life into, I know it will sound weird, brings back life into life of Job. Okay? Or brings up spirit into life of Job. But what God begins with? Then Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, Who is this that darkens the counsel by words without knowledge? Dress your action like a man, and I will question you, and you make it known to me. Where you were when I laid the foundations of the earth. And so on and so forth. I mean, I love this passage. 38, 39, where he goes through different aspects of creation. And not necessarily putting Job down. The question is, it's not a rhetorical question. At least I don't take them as really rhetorical question, assuming that you are so small you have no clue what you're talking about. I think he invites Job to ponder on the mysteries of creations. And since God knows about that, you might want to trust that God who will provide for you. It's not something to put Job down, but it's encourage Job to trust in God. Okay? He doesn't compare him to an ant or a worm or something like that. What he does is actually lifts him up and says, I am the God who created everything. I am the one who knows the boundaries for the sea. And sea can go as far as, but not further. Okay? I am the one who allows, fish to play in the sea, and especially this giant Leviathan. And we still have no clue what is that. Okay? But I am the one speaking to you. And therefore, I am ready to have relationship with you. And Job knows that, and he kind of, okay, I'll put my hand on my mouth. And again, we can take it differently. We can take it as, I'm so, stupid and dumb, that I'm not going to say anything. Or Okay, I did say something that probably I should have said it. Now I want to keep my mouth shut. Why do you want to keep your mouth shut? Because when you keep your mouth shut, usually it's easier for listening. And he listens. And God continues to talk after that. It's very interesting. So this great dialogue that brings Job kind of back after a pivotal point about wisdom, it goes back and there is a beginning of the process of Job to be restored. And then at the very end of the book, so we have beginning of the book, chapters 1 and 2, it's a prose, and then basically everything is poetry. I know the Hebrew poetry is not English poetry and it's not Russian poetry, it's not rhymic, it's more with the rhythm and play on words, there are puns all over the place and so on and so forth. But so we have a prose, chapters 1 and 2, and we have a prose beginning with verse 7 of chapter 42. Now look at that. He deals with other guys. And it's very interesting. When God, addresses Job, he uses poetic words. But when he talks to those three friends, he speaks very plain, simple. It's kind of like, I don't know, the charge at the court. You're charged with this. My anger burns with you. Okay? That's what he says to Eliphaz. Okay, verse 7. And then, and against you and two of your friends. For you have not spoken of me for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has. Okay? So within this conversation, we do not really see how Job sins. What we see is those guys presented three different, let's say, models for life. And by themselves, their models were not bad, but they cannot answer in the time of transition and trouble. In the times of transition and trouble, you cannot simply rely on tradition. We used to do it all the time. It's very good to repeat from time to time. But sometimes there is a moment that you cannot rely on tradition. 2 years ago, when I came here first time as a vacancy pastor, what tradition would help us to understand that we need to do something on the patio and have a curbside communion? There was nothing in the books. I mean, Lutheran service book, you open the agenda and it says, oh, curbside communion, do this. No, there was nothing like that. Me and elders had to just figure out something on the spot. Same thing with the rationale. Some rationales do work, but sometimes you need to kind of step a little bit above, and that's what is called wisdom, and so on and so forth. So he talks to those guys, and then he restores Job. Okay? Verse 10. Now, it's very interesting. And the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. And the Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. And if you want to go back in chapter 1, so the number of camels, the number of sheep, the number of yokes of oxen, donkeys, all of that, it's twice less in the beginning. And now he has twice as much. So what it should remind you that for example, in Matthew 25, we have a story of the master who gave 5, 2, and 1 talents. Remember? So what happened? The one who had 5, what did he do?
Blew it.
He gave it up. So for a period of time, he had no control over this 5. He gave it up. He had 0 for a period of time in his hands. And he ended up with 10. Okay? The one who had 2 did the same. He gave it up and he ended up with 4. The guy who had 1 always controlled the 1 because he is the one who buried it. Okay? And at the very end, he ended up with 0 because this 1 went right here. Okay? So that's very interesting. That's what we have in the biblical paradigm. When we go through trouble, if we go through trouble properly, God gives us more on the other end. It's not necessarily with money. It's not necessarily with what we have. Sometimes it's skill. Sometimes it's relationship. When husband and wife go through a trouble, okay? If they go through trouble properly, their relationship will be same, weaker, or stronger on the other end? Stronger, okay? That's what it is, okay? So you have something, you go down, but then you go here, okay? Jesus comes and says, it is good for you that I will leave. And disciples were like paralyzed with that idea. He's going to leave us. But he goes through death and resurrection. And what happened after that?
They believed him.
What happened is ascension, and right after ascension, we have the Holy Spirit. Now, the divine presence is not on one locale where Jesus is, but we can pray everywhere, and by the power of the Holy Spirit, Father will hear us. Okay? So basically, that's kind of the paradigm of the whole book of Job. How you go through a spiritual struggle and how you get, on the other end of the tunnel. I kind of supplied some information, at least it was interesting for me, on the other end with the Lutheran teaching and, relevancy of the book. You can study this at home. The main takeaway is, even in the book of Job, and we have a hymn, very famous hymn that we sing for Easter, is in the book of Job we have this wonderful statement about resurrection. For I know that my Redeemer lives. Okay? You probably know that hymn by heart. I know that my Redeemer lives, so on and so forth. Okay, and that's from Job. So I as a memory verse, I gave it to you right here. So in chapter 19, verses 25, 26, he says, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth or dust. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet with my flesh I see God. Okay, so that's an idea of resurrection that we have even in Old Testament. Okay, questions or comments?